Hey, EVC listeners, it's Ed here. Before we jump into this week's episode, we wanted to give you a heads up that we are planning our next live, in-person show ahead of the holidays. Energy vs. Climate email subscribers will get early access to tickets, so sign up at energyversusclimate.com. Our last in-person event sold out quickly, so don't miss your chance. Now here's the show. Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, in August of this year, the United States passed the biggest climate bill in its history, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. The act represents a major turning point in U.S. climate action at the federal level, and virtually overnight has made the U.S. a very attractive place for clean energy capital investment. But what is actually in the IRA, and what comes next for implementation? How does the U.S. approach compare to Canada's on climate? What might its impact be here? And what should Canada do to stay competitive? To help us answer these questions, we recruited Katherine Hamilton, formerly of the much-loved Energy Gang podcast. Katherine is chair of 38 North Solutions and an international clean energy policy expert. She was an original and longtime host of the Energy Gang and is now a regular contributor to the Carbon Copy podcast. Once again, for this episode, we played around with our format a little bit. First, you'll hear my chat with Katherine about the Inflation Reduction Act. After that, David, Sarah, and I unpack what IRA means for Canada and Canadian low-carbon industrial policy. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Katherine Hamilton. Katherine Hamilton, welcome to Energy vs. Climate.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're very happy to have you on, and we're all big fans of the Energy Gang. But let's talk about U.S. climate policy. It took a giant leap forward with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I will call IRA, during the course of this interview, and it was signed into law by President Joe Biden on August 16th, 2022. So we look forward to getting into the specifics of IRA with you momentarily, but let's set the context in the lead up to the act. So what had the Biden administration accomplished on climate prior to IRA? And we all remember during the 2020 election that he set expectations pretty high for what he was to accomplish.
You're exactly right. So in the campaign, Biden promised to focus on climate, the economy, equity, and COVID. And he's done all of those things. So immediately out of the gate, the first thing he did was get back into Paris. That was the first thing he needed to do to signal that we were serious about climate as a nation. Then he started working on not just the Inflation Reduction Act, which was called Build Back Better at the time, but also this bipartisan deal that actually got passed ahead of IRA. And that was really going to be something that everybody could agree that would lay the foundation for whatever the climate bill would be. So this ended up being $1.2 trillion that would go to agencies to support scaling projects. And that is still being deployed now. It has not even begun hardly to be deployed, especially on energy technologies. There are a lot of funding opportunities out there that a lot of companies are applying to or responding to for requests for information. But that is still live. And those are foundational to making sure that the market mechanisms that IRA creates actually can become implemented. And what Biden did is, in addition to start working with Congress and making sure that from an international perspective, we were seen as more serious, was he focused the entire government, every single agency, on solving all of these problems. So he focused all of the agencies on climate in some way so that he could make sure that it is addressed by every single agency. And you'll see that through our administrative actions, through Environmental Protection Agency that regulates emissions, or through the Securities and Exchange Commission that is going to have public companies actually disclose carbon risks. So from an executive level, from the president, he can get a lot done before he even works with Congress.
So that's great to know, because we'll talk about IRA in a second. definitely the perception, he's clearly done a lot in his administration, his colleagues. The perception, though, amongst many was still unfulfilled potential. And then IRA comes along, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this hugely encouraging development for the fight against global climate change, not just U.S. climate change, given the share of global emissions that the U.S. represents. And the act itself, it represents the largest investment in addressing climate change in U.S. history, close to $400 billion. Now, the Democrats claim that the act is going to cut U.S. emissions, CO2 emissions, by roughly 40% by 2030. And the act also allows President Biden to do what U.S. presidents have done in the past, and that is go to a COP meeting, in this case, COP27 coming up in Egypt in November, saying, hey, we know we don't price carbon federally, but don't worry about it. We're going to invest our way to achieving our target. So how will this specific spending authorization do that? How is it going to help specifically the U.S. hit its target?
Yeah, so that is a great question because, as I mentioned in this infrastructure bill, what you're doing is just funding through grant funding, basically a host of projects that you hope will be catalytic and that will help different technologies scale. But what IRA does is it sets the market signals. So basically, it shifts investment, it shifts industry all toward trying to make sure that they can take advantage of all these tax credits for a variety of new technologies, not just solar and wind, which now have a 10-year runway, but also all these new technologies, whether it's interconnection, which can just sink a project, the cost of interconnecting to the utility, microgrids, hydrogen, energy storage that I've been working on since 2009, manufacturing of all types, especially manufacturing batteries, which is really a game changer, electric vehicles. There are just a host of tax credits now that are really shifting markets so that it only makes sense to invest in the clean energy transition. It also provides bonus credits to really start intentionally incentivizing development in poor middle income communities because, and I worked a lot on these credits where you can't just tack on, oh, let's help poor people at the end. You really have to build it into your policy and you have to be thoughtful about how to design it. So there are tax credits of 10 and 20% additional for low and middle income communities. There's an additional 10% tax credit for energy communities. So these are communities that have been subjected to either coal development or coal production in their communities. And there's also a bonus for domestic content to try to get more content here in the U.S. And more production in the U.S. And then also there are all these labor provisions to try to make sure that these jobs are actually good jobs.
So this is playing to the U.S. traditional strength on climate, and that is U.S. Congress knows how to spend, and now it has the authorization to spend, although spend's a bit of a funny word because really it's like foregoing tax revenue. But just to ensure that I have this right, so here's a scenario, and tell me if it's right or wrong. A renewable electricity producer can generate tax credits on its low carbon electricity. And say, for argument's sake, let's say that electricity, that power is going to power a carbon capture plant. The carbon capture developer can generate tax credits when capturing CO2. And to help, for instance, that capture project might be helping to produce low carbon hydrogen. The hydrogen producer can generate the tax credits on its low carbon hydrogen, and then it can use that to produce sustainable aviation fuel, which also generates tax credits. Is that when you say a whole host of tax credits? Is it that extensive?
Yes, it is. And you can take the tax credits in a number of ways. So you have an option of having an investment tax credit, which basically requires an investment. I'm going to build this and then I will get a credit back for the money that I spent on it. And then there's also production tax credit. And that means you get paid by the kilowatt hour of what you're producing or the kilogram of what you're producing. So there are a couple of different ways that this can be done. But yes, essentially it covers the entire value chain and also hits pretty much every sector of the economy.
Yeah. Or to your investment tax credit, production tax credit example, like the 45Q, you get a production tax credit on CO2 per ton once it's in the ground and stored.
Yes, exactly. And what this does is it's not grants, it's not giving out money. What it is it does require investment from developers, from utilities, technology companies, and then it gives them credit for investing in things that are clean.
So this is a massive step forward and a real success for President Biden's climate agenda. Now, his agenda was in the news for the first half of 2022, I'd say for all the wrong reasons. And that's principally because it was held hostage by that other Joe, Senator Joe Manchin, who pulled his support from what you mentioned, the Build Back Better bill, principally, and the news reporting was because of its aggressiveness on clean energy transition measures. And then we got the surprise announcement of this secret negotiation that led to a deal between Senator Manchin and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on July 27th. And personal story, I was out for a mountain bike ride. I live in a mountainous part of Canada. And when the news of the deal broke, my text alerts just started going bing, 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 bing from all these Canadians who still follow what's happening and never saw this coming and suddenly wanted to share news about it and get on a group text chat. But give us to the degree that you can, the politics, the insider baseball on that. How did those two come to agree upon the climate provisions of the bill?
So I work with both of those gentlemen and their staff a lot. They were not always diverging in any way. Where Senator Manchin diverged from the president was that the original Build Back Better package had a lot of social programs in it included that had nothing to do with climate. And Senator Manchin said, I can't put these into. I'm not interested in having these. I'm interested in climate. And he actually never veered from that. And so it was scaled down, but the climate piece, for the most part, stayed intact. Now, some things shifted a bit. For example, the electric vehicle credit shifted to try to get folks to come and produce and manufacture here in the US. But otherwise, for the most part, things stayed the way they were in the climate front. And, I think that's because people were very engaged from a very grassroots level all the way to the top. People knew that this was the future. Everybody from big banks to folks on the street knew this is something we have to do. Climate change is confronting us every day in our faces. It's affecting everything we do, whether it's on the business side or in our homes. And we have to get this done. And I think Senator Manchin all along was really on board with a lot of that. I mean, his state is full of people living in poverty. His state is one of those that could benefit the most from being able to have a clean energy transition. And I think based on what he has negotiated in this, that will happen.
Great. Okay. That's two rapid fire questions for you. One, what is important about the IRA that isn't getting the attention it deserves, let's say in media coverage? And two, where do the sand traps lie for it? And that what might prevent it from achieving the hugely ambitious goals contained within the Act?
Okay. So a couple things quickly. One is that I did mention this is a 10-year runway. That's huge because that really does shift investment in a way that is very sustainable. The other thing is there's a methane pollution fee. Methane's huge. That is going to make a material difference in emissions. The equity provisions are really, really important. The battery production tax credit will really be a game changer for battery manufacturing in the US. Something that wasn't in the bill that I think is important and that fell out at the last minute was an investment tax credit for transmission building. And, transmission is part of that foundation. It's part of the connective tissue that we're going to really need investment in. And folks who build merchant transmission plants are going to have a really hard time with their CapEx. So it's important that we pay attention to that over the long term, that we really make sure transmission is incentivized and also distribution build out is incentivized as well. So I think those are things we need to watch out for. Something that I'm spending every single day on right now is implementation, because as you're saying, you want to make sure this is implemented in the way that it was intended to be implemented and that it's done efficiently, effectively, and gets to the communities that really need to benefit.
So is there anything else in the Act that you haven't mentioned so far that is still really important?
Yes. There is a huge $20 billion program that basically would set up a national green bank, a climate bank, and it would be sitting outside of government. It would have authority to do things that our government can't do. Our government is pretty limited in being, senior debt and doing some loans, but this would be able to do a whole host of things financially that could really spark state green banks, that could spark state energy offices and others to really participate more and to build capacity on the ground in communities. So I think that's a piece that we need to pay attention to, this kind of national green bank.
I'm resisting the temptation to get into the Canada Infrastructure Bank or the Clean Growth Fund, which we have comparable things. But so with the news cycle filled with, stories of controversial former NFL star running backs on the hustings, and then we've got Michael Moore now talking about Rovember. We're up here constantly reminded that it's fall midterm election season in the U.S. So let's just talk about those midterms, and let's assume, for argument's sake, that the Democrats lose the House and Senate in the midterms. So what impact will that partisan shift have on IRA's climate goals?
So I don't think that shift will have a direct impact yet on the climate goals. It will certainly prevent anything additional from happening. And the U.S. Congress holds the purse strings for the federal government. So just on appropriating funds to keep the government going, that will have an impact. But the pieces that are in IRA are pretty strong. I mean, they are tax credits unless they were to completely rewrite the tax code. And I'll give you a little secret. When you give somebody something, don't ever try to take it away. So, you're going to have all of these people taking advantage of credits. And in fact, manufacturers are already moving into states that are heavily Republican states. And the last thing they want is those tax credits to go away. And in fact, during the Trump administration, they never put on the table rolling back solar and wind tax credits. They just didn't, because they knew that was a losing proposition for them.
Yeah, nor the 45Q tax credit. In fact, I think it was strengthened under the Trump administration.
Absolutely. So it would be really hard to roll this back. And certainly the president would never sign anything like that. So we can't imagine that happening during this administration. I do think it will be harder for the president to, for example, get judges confirmed if the Senate were to flip. And the Senate, remember, is at a razor-thin margin. It's 50-50. So the vice president is the tie-breaking vote in our U.S. Senate. The Senate is the body that confirms the judges. And so all the Supreme Court justices, but also justices throughout the federal system. And often those are the ones that are taking decisions on energy issues. And so we just have to remember that will have an impact whether he can get many judges confirmed.
Got you. Okay, well, let's talk about the presidency, and let's assume, again, that the Democrats lose the presidency in 2024. We've got some Republican president, maybe named Trump, may not be named Trump, sitting in the White House again in 2024 that could be very hostile to Biden, Obama, your action on climate. So you'd already talked about the durability of IRA, which is terrific for those of us who support its climate goals. But then, so let's talk about its resiliency in the face of executive orders that could attempt to overturn some of its provisions.
I definitely think from an administrative standpoint. So I mentioned upfront all of the things that President Biden has been able to do within the government, within his own authority. So remember, that could also flip. So you could decide, no, none of the employees in the government are working on climate. We're not going to go forward as rulemakings, for example, like increasing appliance standards or increasing auto efficiency standards. We're not going to do that. We're going to put the brakes on. So you could do that. And those are really important activities. You could pull back on the SEC climate goal, all of the carbon risk disclosures that they're doing now, and requiring businesses, even Scope 3 emissions, to be reported on. So that could definitely roll back. I don't think that in and of itself will change investment. I mean, investment is moving clean. So I don't think it will change investment. It will do one other really awful thing, potentially, of course, I'm just saying hypothetically, and that is to change the way we are seen internationally. And we took a real hit during the Trump administration in all of those negotiations. And the U.S. really wants to have a leadership position and needs to have a leadership position in those negotiations. And the fact that an entire political party does not believe in climate change, it's the only one in the world, an entire political party that does not believe or care about it. And I'm not saying individual. So there are lots of individuals that are Republicans that do care, and they see it every single day in their home states. But that is a huge threat, is our international standing.
For sure. And we all wish the issue would eventually become post-partisan. We're not there yet. But going back to that international standing and thinking of this COP27 meeting coming up, and typically countries want to bring something new to a COP meeting, something new, shiny thing in the store window. What comes next for the U.S.? Is this it? And not to say it's not enough, but is this it for climate policy in the U.S. for the next little while, in the lead up to COP, post-COP? Or do you think there are more things that can get done, like some of the measures you talked about that fell out at the 11th hour?
So I think there are some bits and pieces of what I would call cleanup pieces, technical fixes that could happen. I think this was the big climate legislation. It's the biggest thing we've ever done. Remember, we tried it 10 years ago. It was a very different construct. It was much more punitive, and this is much more incentive-based. But I think this is the big climate piece. I think now we have to implement it. We have to do it effectively. We have to show what we've done. We need to track it and make sure that we actually are lowering emissions. I think we need to address other sectors of the economy that are much harder to decarbonize, especially on the industrial side, on the agriculture side, and try to focus on those. We may not be able to get a lot done if our Congress shifts party in a big way, the way we've done this. But I do think we'll still be able to make progress. And I think the proof will be in the pudding.
I remember actually being in D.C. when Warner-Lieberman, that bill was announced in, I want to say 2008, 2009. And there, even though it was kind of DOA, it was like, wow, this is really significant. If this one doesn't succeed, the next one can't be far around the corner. And here we are more than a dozen years later. When we look at Canada versus the U.S., we often think of, well, in Canada, we price carbon, and the U.S. is not doing that for a whole bunch of reasons, at the federal level, at least, and just because politically it's very difficult. So instead, it's driving clean energy development through investment and through using the tax system to achieve clean energy outcomes. And going back to Warner-Lieberman, which had proposed a cap and trade system back at the time at a carbon price, is that now a moot point in U.S. policy debates? Are we post-carbon pricing in the U.S.?
Well, it has been a dream of a lot of people for a long time. Unfortunately, the way the dream was originally laid out, it would be in place of other regulations. So you would just have a price on carbon and that's all you need. You don't have to do anything else. And I think that became very risky to folks that want to regulate and want to make sure that there are certain industries that have oversight. So we will still be regulating emissions of all types. But I think a price on carbon is certainly not politically doable at this point. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to be tracking it. So I have mentioned this before, that we are going to be tracking carbon, and there will be, I think, a robust global market for it. And I could see that happening over time. I just think that you're right. The measures that we've put into place are much more market-based.
Great. Okay. My very last question, and not to do with climate policy. Katherine, how has life been post the energy gang? What are you doing in all this found time you must have? And I ask not with, disinterest, and myself and Sarah and David, my co-hosts, not, dear listener, that we're going anywhere anytime soon, but we're curious to know, what's it like when you have a podcast and you leave, and how much found time do you have?
A lot of found time. The energy gang was absolutely a labor of love. It kept me intellectually tuned in to topics that I normally would not have known anything about. Stephen would send us the 3 stories every week, and I would just freak out and say, I don't know anything about anything. And I would then immediately start calling all my friends, everybody I knew. Do you know anything about this or that? And it was a really good exercise for me every week. It was a lot of work. I have a lot of work now. We had a lot of work to get IRA over the finish line. And now with this implementation, there is just so much to do. So it is good to have the time to do it. I miss it. I miss Stephen and Jigger so much. We all text each other, and Stephen and I are always, nudging Jigger, like, when are you going to leave? When are you going to leave? But it's fun. It gives me time to listen to other shows like yours, for example.
Thank you, Katherine. Words of wisdom from one who has gone before us, but we're all big fans and we're really grateful for your time today.
Thank you so much for listening. It's such an honor.
So David and Sarah, we just heard from Katherine Hamilton about climate policy in the U.S., specifically about IRA, and even about podcasting. Do the two of you have anything to add about IRA before we talk about what it means for Canada?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. I read some summaries of it and tried to read some of the actual text, which is very painful, and have had a bunch of conversations. And I got to say, energy versus climate listeners won't be surprised to know that I often start things from a very critical point of view. And I kind of found the thing to be a lot better than I expected in a bunch of specific ways. One of the most important is there's ways in which it's more technology neutral or moves towards technology neutrality in ways that were really quite impressive. So, an obvious example is they're phasing out the separate wind and solar production credits and replacing them with something that's a clean energy production credit. And in fact, nuclear power will get something that's virtually the same as those two. So that's really inching towards something that's a low carbon production credit, which is a thing that I and many others have long advocated. And, if you look at what they did for hydrogen, similar. They didn't say blue hydrogen produced this way gets X and, stinky black hydrogen gets Y. They had a set of 4 categories of the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, and those things get different tax credits, but that's technology neutral. And there are actually quite a lot of other examples like that I think are kind of an exciting step that people really were thinking towards that. I mean, obviously the big context is that doing this all through the tax law is not the way that probably almost anybody wanted to do it, but it's a reality of the fact that that could get passed in the current Congress in a way that regulatory changes couldn't have. But it really is, I think, quite a big thing. Maybe the one other thing that is important politically is that this turns the EPA into an agency that gives out money, which it hasn't been. So DOE is, and the EPA has been a regulatory agency. It used to give out money for water. But I think that may change the relationship between EPA and communities and change it in kind of profound ways in the long run that might make it easier for it to be an effective regulator. So there are really a lot of changes in the IRA.
Yeah, and good point about the EPA. Like this is a spending authorization bill, and one thing that U.S. presidents and Congress know how to do is to spend. And I also like the point, David, about
no, this had nothing to do with spending. No, this bill was really just a tax bill. I mean, I'm joking, but that's the whole structure of the way that it's all written is that in order to get through the arcane details of how to pass things in this kind of Congress that I don't understand very well, it is technically all tax measures.
It's mostly tax measures. There's still some grants in there. But yeah, I'm using spending synonymously with avoided tax revenue. So I'm happy to be more specific and just say avoided tax revenue.
You're right. It's a mixture. Yes, agree.
Yeah. And the example we used with Katherine, in that whether you're a SAF producer or a hydrogen producer, low carbon electricity producer, or a CCS developer, you get a tax break, like Oprah, tax breaks for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting piece of this, of course, is that it almost certainly violates the World Trade Organization rules, and nobody cares. We're just in a new world now where those rules are not going to be meaningfully enforced. And I think maybe it's good now to toss it over to Sarah, who knows the Canadian situation better. But the reality of the fact that governments are doing things that would break WTO, I think probably applies to both. But over to you, Sarah.
Yeah. So if I look at there's been a lot written and tweeted and whatever other medium about the differences between IRA and what we have in Canada. And I think we'll get a little bit into this question of, the WTO rules. In the end, Canada sort of snuck in under the wire there, in that a lot of the kind of restrictions around who gets the tax credits includes things that are manufactured in North America, not in the United States. So we are, well positioned on that note. But I think, I guess I'm of the mind that there is more similarities between what Canada and the U.S. is doing than maybe on the face of it. Of course, I mean, maybe I'll start with the differences. So I think, clearly one difference is that this was sort of all in IRA plus, of course, the two bills, the CHIPS and infrastructure bill that came before, was sort of the all in one big shot that Canada, or that the US, is taking on climate. And so that, is maybe different from Canada sort of continuing to add pieces over the term of our current federal government. But a lot of the pieces I think are actually more similar, in this idea of, we hear a lot about, well, the US is all carrots and Canada has so many sticks, and there's a big difference there. Certainly, as Katherine went through and explained, on methane, actually, that's, that I think the U.S. is doing something that's quite a bit more similar, really, to what's happening in Canada. They have, and maybe some of the differences come out in implementation. They have a green bank, sounds a lot like what we're trying to do here in Canada. We can debate whether or not, that's been successful in the implementation. And Katherine did highlight implementation, of course, as one of the big challenges. But even when you talk about the tax credits, we do have accelerated depreciation and specific credits that can be accessed in our tax code. And we have, of course, as everybody knows, a price on carbon, but especially in the way that is rolled out, say, within the Alberta system and the industrial price on carbon with the generation of free offsets or free allocations, the value of those is actually, when I did a back of the envelope calculation, and in the electricity sector, for example, in 2023, if we assume we follow the federal price on carbon schedule, the value of the offsets that wind and solar get is actually almost identical to the value of the ITC and PTC for wind and solar. So there's a lot there that, looks pretty similar. I got to give the U.S. credit for something that I think we haven't done enough on the Canadian side, which is some of the environmental equity and justice elements, and putting in additional funding for projects that are taking that into account and creating opportunities in low-income communities. So I think that the U.S. has done more there than we've done in Canada, but that's my sort of first crack at the comparison between the two.
So, Sarah, could the summary of the first part of that be, come to Canada where our sticks are actually carrots?
Exactly. I've been playing around with the carrot sticks and then carrot stick analogy. I think the thing to turn our sticks really firmly into carrots is would be a more of a guarantee on the price on carbon. And I was actually just in Ottawa and heard, I'm pretty sure that I heard the minister say that carbon contracts for difference, which would, create that carbon price certainty, is coming. I don't know, when and what kind of how much certainty there is behind that statement, but I think that could be, a big missing piece that would really provide that kind of certainty that would hopefully make those bankable.
Yes, and to build upon that, Sarah, we'll need that, because when you look at it and you use the renewables example, you could say on a dollar-by-dollar basis or dollar-to-dollar basis, Canada is just as attractive as the U.S. But the big difference right now is the political uncertainty. And because of that political uncertainty, and getting to what's the impact on Canada of IRA, the reality is that the U.S. has suddenly become a very attractive place for capital, and money will flow to the most attractive jurisdiction that provides that stability. And with IRA, the amazing thing about it is it actually has bipartisan support. And I'm not talking about the vote in the Senate, but normally, this kind of government intervention is political kryptonite to the GOP and its supporters. And yet there was a report that came out of the University of Maryland's program for public consultation that showed the bulk of IRA's energy and environment provisions had Republican backing, including the tax credits. And as we heard from Katherine, it's very difficult to take something away once it's there, and a lot of that development is happening in Republican states. Now, contrast that with Canada. We've got a tremendous amount of uncertainty in Canada's biggest emitting province in Alberta, with, regime change here. And then we've got a lot of potential uncertainty with Pierre Poilievre, the new leader of the Conservative Party, who's speaking very openly about killing the carbon price. So in the absence of that kind of backstop, like what Minister Guilbeault talked about earlier this week, then companies outside of Canada are saying, well, I could invest here in Canada, and the carbon market, the compliance value of my investment might disappear by 2025, whereas now in the US, I have this 10-year runway. And that's, I think, the big challenge that Canada faces now in the competition for that clean energy investment.
Yeah, so to put it bluntly, is it the correct read, Ed, that even assuming the Republicans take the House and Senate in the midterms, it seems kind of likely, that's not going to change IRA, it's not going to disappear. Whereas in Canada, if Pierre Poilievre takes the prime ministership, there's a good chance things change a lot.
Absolutely. And because in Canada, compared to the U.S., and this is the irony, as we heard from Katherine, where you've got, the Republican Party, a big chunk of whom doesn't accept the overwhelming scientific evidence for climate change. But the reality is they've been able to develop bipartisan support for their policy supports for fighting climate change. Whereas here in Canada, where we have 2/3 of voters in each and every federal election voting for progressive parties with progressive climate platforms, we haven't developed that policy durability yet.
Well, I think it's a form of the, I would read that as it's sort of the different tools that are being used, right? And the idea of a carbon contract for difference is very similar to what the ITC, PTC, and, tax credit type legislation does, which is to say that, it gives you that guarantee that once the project is built, it's going to continue to have the value for its carbon reductions over the lifetime, and it doesn't depend on the policy that might change later. So, I think we're obviously, there's two ways to look at it. One is to say, well, we don't have it, so therefore we have no certainty. The other is that, we've built up this system that is almost there, and we're missing this one final puzzle piece. And this is a solvable problem that the government in Ottawa has committed now to solving. So I think there's very likely that we could be there in the coming months.
Just to qualify that or put a caveat, Sarah, and I've had multiple discussions about carbon contract for difference policy with the federal government. I would say that Minister Guilbeault is ahead of his department and ahead of bureaucrats on the issue in Ottawa generally. So encouraging. There's still a bunch of design questions you have to figure out, including, are you backstopping relative to where the carbon price schedule should be a year from now or 2 years from now? Or are you backstopping what kind of investable price you actually need to get first of a kind plants done? And there's a bit of a divide between the two. But we've got that musing, and that's encouraging. There's still a lot of work to be done, as far as I'm concerned, to convince the rest of the government of Canada that they need another policy tool to help with industrial decarbonization. So let's talk about what has been the industry government response so far. And one anecdote, and from talking to an industry that is looking at competing capital or capital competition between Canada and the US, and already I'm hearing, and this could just be saber rattling, of someone who develops clean energy infrastructure here in Canada saying, why would we bother with Canada at this point? Let's just invest in the US.
I think the saber rattling, let's see where the investments flow. I do think that there is some certainly saber rattling in all of this. And there are ways in which the policy, if Canadian companies want to see the opportunities there, can actually seize those as well, too. And the policies that David referenced that are maybe questionable from a trade perspective of saying, we're going to give incentives for EVs at different levels if they're produced in North America, that's a huge opportunity for Canada to be, as we've talked about before, I think, a supplier of not just the raw materials, the lithium that goes into the battery, but actually the battery facilities themselves and potentially even the vehicles. Right. And so, it's not clear to me. The U.S., of course, it's simply a much bigger country. It has a much bigger, the federal government has a much bigger size purse. And so I don't think it's necessarily smart in Canada for us to try to compete. And obviously at the same scale, we simply couldn't. We should rather be looking for ways to take advantage of sort of what we were given through the inclusion as part of North America to be producing these whatever it is, the products that the U.S. is going to be demanding. And I don't see why, that can't be happening here in Canada.
I think it can be happening, and each individual company and investor is going to play differently, and saber rattling by Canadian potential investors that say they'll walk out the door unless they get X cookies from the government is a standard part of the game. But I do think that there's a kind of interesting potential shift here where, despite the fact that Canada is more liberal and, at a kind of caricature level, it seems like Canadian governments get climate change much more. And, our prime minister is cuter. Despite all those things, it might well be that systematically the balance has shifted to really tend to tip money into the U.S. rather than Canada, though there will be exceptions.
Yeah. So that's building upon that point, David. I wonder if this is a competition that structurally Canada just can't win. Even though we had Prime Minister Trudeau on the weekend just say, hey, he responded, it was put to him, we got to continue to be competitive as a country. We want the world to come here and invest. And I'm already hearing musings at the bureaucratic level that new policies are coming. But I look at the comparison because it's very newsworthy. Prime Minister Liz Truss resigned yesterday in the UK. She embarked on a mini budget that had disastrous tax cuts that collapsed the pound, collapsed the economy. And in some ways, she was trying to mimic the US, but with one big difference is that the UK is a much smaller economy. It's open, and the pound is not the global reserve currency, whereas in the US, it is. There are things you can do through the US economy that you can't do anywhere else in the world. And I wonder if this IRA just would not work in any other place because no other place has that kind of economic heft.
Yeah, no, that macroeconomic piece is it's a separate thing. The fact that the U.S. Fed raising rates is forcing the rest of the world to do that in a way that wouldn't otherwise make sense is another factor that tips it.
And I mean, I think I'm sort of maybe agreeing with your point, Ed, and this is something Brendan Haley has also raised on the industrial policy side. We only can compete in Canada if we really become narrow and focused. And I think it's another version of saying, what you're saying there, that like we simply can't compete on the size of the funding that we can provide to companies directly in what I would call less of an industrial policy sense and more of a corporate support, which is, a big part of what IRA has in it. I don't think that we're going to win that competition. What we can do is something that is historically challenging for Canada, but we have managed at times to focus really and pick some areas that the federal government is going to focus on and not try to do this, sprinkling of support across all the different areas. And that is going to definitely lead to a lot of saber rattling because, the ones that aren't selected are going to feel maybe rightly so that they're being left out. But I think that gets back to, some of the topics that we discussed many shows back now with Danny Ruddick around, how do you do good industrial policy in a small country? And I think it is fundamentally different than, how you do it in a big country.
Total agreement.
And good point. I mean, IRA, though it's Inflation Reduction Act, it really is, it seems like it's the Industrial Policy Act for the U.S. going forward. And they're betting heavily that this is where the puck is going, to use a Canadianism, and then we are going to back that. David, curious to get your take and happy to make this the final word. And I know we've played around with the thought experiment. If you were energy czar, if you were industrial policy czar for Canada, what would your response be to IRA?
It would be to focus on a really narrow set of things. It would be to set up some kind of new weird commission for slaying turkeys, which would include some people from the federal system and some industry experts, because I think the big challenge Canada has is it tends to spread money too evenly. And once it's funded something that turns into a turkey, it just can't stop. And so I really believe that a small country like Canada needs industrial policy, but the key piece of it is to have a really effective way to slay the turkeys. And so that's what I do. But do I think there's a political chance of that happening near term? No, it requires a level of spine that I don't think the current government has.
Sarah?
So I would, I'll take my answer a slightly different way, which is to say, and Katherine raised this, but I mean, the fact that it's called IRA, that it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, I think that's also a conversation we need to have more of in Canada, right? And there is, Trevor, a colleague of mine, Trevor Toom at the U of C, has looked at the components of inflation that Canada has been facing, which have been largely in the energy sector. Another colleague, Blake Schaefer, disaggregated that and really showed that across the country, at least, that's really primarily in the oil and gas prices, right? Unsurprising, given that that's where we're, more exposed to that global market. Of course, there's some other things going on within Alberta in the electricity sector, but largely speaking, when people are facing rising energy bills, one of the big answers to that is electrification. It is the things that we need to do that are exactly the same things that we need to do to reduce our emissions. And so I think that we sort of tend to skip over that title of the bill and drop down immediately into the details. But that was chosen, the way that I think it's being communicated in the U.S. is very clearly, and the way it's being sold to, the broad U.S. population is around how do you help secure consumers and households from inflation tied to energy prices and the overlap between that and climate action. And I think that is, increasingly important. And obviously that wasn't part of the conversation, even couple of years ago, because that was not the, inflationary world in which we were living. But I do think that is something that we may indeed see the federal government speaking more about, but also really needs to become more part of that conversation, both at the kind of consumer level, but then also I think, like I mentioned in the beginning, what is Canada going to do to match some of the thinking in the US around, equality and focusing on certain low-income communities, which, they need to be doing more. And let me be clear, there's a lot of criticism about that having been left out of this bill, but there's at least some components of it in there that I think are ahead of where we're thinking about that in Canada.
I'd weigh in on that. Maybe I'm putting my feet into dangerous waters, but I personally would do much more on inequality in both countries, including stuff that some Liberals don't want about housing policy and education policy. But I actually am a little skeptical of some of the provisions in IRA. I think that in general, measures to deal with clean energy and measures to do with inequality and historical injustice are just different buckets, and mixing them has produced a bunch of stuff at the interface that isn't really the most effective thing you do on either.
So I'll pick up on both your comments around sort of being fairly narrow and focused. I think that makes sense for me. If I were industrial policy czar, I'd be working full-time 24/7 on that policy certainty question. And shy of being a Putin-like autocrat and working in a democracy, you have a narrow set of tools. But to your point, Sarah, around electrification, if I'm an electricity developer or a solar wind developer, with the uncertainty right now around the clean electricity regulation, the future of Alberta's industrial carbon pricing policy, the future of carbon pricing in Canada generally, those sticks, a grant program that's been re-released but has a very strong cap to it, then I would say, why aren't we going to Montana and developing that wind and solar project where the supports are very clear and obvious because of that uncertainty? I think that's where I'd focus my effort. And then later on, being narrower and more focused. The reality here in Canada that we still faced is we've layered on a bunch of policy supports, and yet the industrial decarbonization capital still isn't flowing in any kind of meaningful way unless government cuts big fat checks. And that's a problem we still have to solve. Okay, let's leave it at that. This is obviously an evolving story that we'll keep tabs on over the course of season 4.
Yeah, and as an original fan of the Energy Gang, it was so great to get the chance to speak with Katherine Hamilton. I know I learned a lot from her about what's going on in the U.S., and obviously we'll be continuing to watch what our neighbor down south is doing.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnijescu. Thanks to Hannah Tai, Priya Kunin-Kulato, and Crystal Hickey for their production support. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. You can also send your feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. We'll be back live on November 7th talking IEA scenarios with Tim Gould. We're looking forward to seeing you then.